So please sit tight and we'll get started very shortly. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us. Just give it a few moments. It takes a little while for Zoom to add everybody to the room. So sit tight and we'll get started in just a few moments. Thank you very much. Okay, hopefully that is long enough for everybody to be in the room. Thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to the latest Duke Media briefing on the COVID-19 pandemic and its effects on society and other things. I am Gregory Phillips with Duke Communications and I'll be moderating this event. Between COVID-19, racial justice and the election, it doesn't seem to matter what the topic is, misinformation is rampant on social media and beyond. We have 4 Duke scholars with us today to discuss the misinformation and disinformation that's warping America's response to its problems and making us ever more polarized. I'll introduce our speakers and get the discussion started, then we'll open it up to questions. We are recording this briefing and that recording will be sent to everyone who registered. Thanks to those reporters who already sent questions. During this discussion, those of you joining us on Zoom can submit questions via the Q&A window at any time. There will also be an opportunity to ask questions in person in a few minutes. Thanks also to everyone watching this on YouTube. So to our participants, with us today is Bill Adair. He is a professor of the practice of journalism and public policy and the director of the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy at Duke's Sanford School of Public Policy. He's also the creator of the Pulitzer Prize winning fact-check website PolitiFact. Good morning, Bill.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Also joining us is Sunshine Hillygus. She is a professor of political science who studies American political behavior, campaigns and elections, survey methods, public opinion, and information technology and politics. Good morning to you.
Morning.
And we have Phil Napoli. He is a professor of public policy at Sanford and a faculty member of the DeWitt Wallace Center, where he researches new ideas for social media regulation, local news deserts, and the contraction of news media. Good morning, Phil.
Good morning.
And also with us is Matt Perrault. He is an associate professor of the practice at the Duke Initiative for Science and Society, where he's also director of the Center on Science and Technology Policy. Before coming to Duke, he was a director of public policy at Facebook. Good morning, Matt.
Good morning.
Okay, Professor Adair, we'll start with you. The spread of misinformation and disinformation has exploded since the advent of social media. But can you give us a sense of the scale of the problem as it stands right now?
That's such a difficult question because the scale is so huge. I remember when we just on the dawn of the internet age, thinking how marvelous the internet was going to be. It was going to empower everyone. It was going to bring information to everyone. It was going to be great for journalism, and here we are 20 years later, and we just see in every corner of the world, in every corner of our lives, that there is just so much misinformation, and it pops up in really insidious ways. And it's really scary. And so we've really, here at Duke, been working on several different aspects of that. The most recent one on fake videos, like the one surfaced over the weekend, involved that another video that suggested that Nancy Pelosi was drunk. And these are things that are not expensive to make, that are not like these deep fakes that we all hear are coming. But this is increasingly the way that misinformation is being spread. So it's big, it's sprawling, it's hard to get a handle on, and it's frightening what it can do to our lives.
Absolutely, thanks. And I'm looking forward to digging into some of the things that you're doing to help combat that in a few moments. But Professor Napoli, I want to move on to you. In 2018, you wrote that fake news is cheap and original reporting is costly. How much has the declining financial fortunes of the news media's business model contributed to the vacuum that's being filled by this kind of misinformation and opinion masquerading as factual reporting? And what, if anything, can be done to reverse that?
Well, you've exactly described the nature of the relationship that we're witnessing right now, which is as local news outlets contract, it creates opportunities for outlets that often have the appearance of traditional local news outlets to move in and sow misinformation in a variety of ways. In some instances, in some communities, we've actually seen these new outlets adopt the name of a defunct news organization. And it's according to some recent research, the number of these types of sites that are either hyper-partisan or in some cases, blatant misinformation sites has actually tripled or doubled, excuse me, in the past 6 months or so. So it's an active process that is ongoing. As far as what to do about it, I think we need to recognize that at this point in time, we've learned all we need to know, perhaps, about whether the traditional commercial model of local journalism is really viable anymore, and we need to start having real conversations about alternative funding models. We've started to see, thank goodness, a number of different foundations move into this space and fund local journalism more aggressively than they have in the past. We've seen platforms like Facebook and Google even contribute funds to local journalism, and we're starting to see some movement at the level of local and state government policies that are designed essentially to bolster the news and information infrastructure for these communities.
Sure, gotcha. Thank you. Lots more to dig in there too. Professor Perel, I'd like to come onto you for a minute. There have been a lot of calls for social media platforms to do more to limit misinformation on their sites. But what are some of the upsides and the downsides of that kind of tighter social media control on information?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. I think there are a couple of potential upsides. One is you might limit the aggregate amount of misinformation. A second upside is that you might reduce impact of misinformation on particularly vulnerable communities, including communities of color. It's also, I think, possible that if you had a more aggressive gatekeeper, if you had social media platforms playing a more aggressive role, it might be that you would get more consistency in the application of their policies and how they enforce their policies. But I think there are a couple of important downsides to note as well. First of all, from a product perspective, social media was not designed to be a publisher. Social media is not a publisher, despite many public proclamations to the contrary. Social media platforms are oriented around user-generated content, and they are designed to enable many different types of people to speak and many diverse perspectives, including perspectives that you and I would find to be incredibly objectionable. It would also be odd at a time when there's increasing focus on the power of tech companies to ask them to play a more aggressive role in moderating speech on their platforms. I think the second major downside is it's not totally clear what the impact would be of more aggressive restrictions on speech. Social media platforms deal with content at scale. They deal with millions and billions of pieces of content. And that means that content moderation policies are more of a hatchet than a scalpel. It tends to be very difficult to ensure that you can keep up all the content that you want to keep up and remove all the content that you want to bring down. There are typically a variety of unintended consequences, and I think it's possible that it could restrict speech in problematic ways. The second is it's not clear that solutions would actually make the problem better. So there was a lot of attention, for instance, on the differential treatment of President Trump's tweets a couple of months ago by Twitter and Facebook. Facebook elected to not add article context, Twitter did. We still don't actually know the impact that Twitter's approach had on the content, and on the people who viewed it. So it's possible that Twitter's approach, I think it's unlikely that Twitter's approach changed many minds. I think people tend to either agree with the president or disagree with the president. I'm not sure adding additional article context would change how people would experience his posts. And I think it's also possible that adding labels would result in more sharing of the information, not less sharing of the information. And if both of those things are true, that the additional article context had limited educational value and potentially increased sharing, then those kinds of approaches are problematic. And the final downside I note is we're just in a moment of incredibly fractured politics, and it's not clear to me that social media platforms can take more aggressive approaches on content without significantly alienating one side of the aisle or the other. As we saw at the tech CEO hearing last week, it was difficult to get through a hearing without conservatives talking almost exclusively about conservative bias, and on the left, people raising concerns about misinformation. Neither issue, I think, is directly really related to antitrust, which was designed to be the focus of the hearing.
Gotcha. Thank you. Certainly a lot to dig into there too. Professor Hillygus, we've already established here that this is a huge problem and not a problem that is easy to solve. But how much of a difference is misinformation in the public sphere making? I mean, when we have hopes for like an informed electorate, are we in fact doomed because of all this misinformation that's flooding everybody's feeds?
I think there's lots of reasons that we want to be concerned about misinformation and about the fact that political leaders and social media organizations are not doing enough to address it. On the other hand, the thing that I would emphasize is that widespread existence is not the same as widespread impact on the public. And I guess I would make three different points to kind of, maybe give a little bit of like, calming sense of what we should make about misinformation and its impact on the electorate. One is that while it's very popular to see a headline in the media about how dumb the American public is because they believe in something, a third of millennials believe that the earth is flat, that a lot of times that the evidence backing up these beliefs are as much the fault of the pollster as of the public. So a tendency to ask questions in ways that they are conveying that the piece of information is an attitude rather than a fact, asking things in ways in which it conflates uncertainty with existence or confidence in the belief. And in one study I did, I found that 55% of people who said that Pizzagate was definitely true turned out to just be trolling the pollster. So we want to be very careful in making sense of the polling data about belief. One of my favorite adages is attributed to George Gallup, that you don't want to overestimate the knowledge of the public, but you also don't want to underestimate their intelligence. And in fact, I have some research with the Polarization Lab here at Duke, in which we looked at the impact of engagement and exposure to the Russian Twitter trolls, and we found a precisely zero effect on public opinion and polarization of the people who were exposed and engaged with those Twitter trolls. And partly it's about who is being exposed, partly it is about how that misinformation fits into the broader information environment. And at the end of the day, in part because people are very polarized in their opinions, persuasion is very, very hard. So I guess that the third point I would make, and that is more of a takeaway, is that I am oftentimes more concerned about media coverage of misinformation than about the misinformation itself. The extent to which the coverage is about divisions within the electorate rather than our similarities, bringing it back to, kind of some of the current debates. There's a lot of coverage, for instance, of examples in which someone is not wearing a mask and confronts somebody in a store. But we're seeing overwhelming support for the use of masks on both sides of the aisle. A recent Ipsos poll found that just 3% of people said they never wore a mask when they left their house. So I think that we want to not normalize misinformation and not necessarily create a categorization of what one tribe is supposed to believe versus the other, because it can lead to cheerleading, where people say, even if they don't truly believe something, that their side is supposed to offer support for a piece of misinformation.
Sure, absolutely. And thanks to all our panelists for those opening answers. We've obviously got a lot to get through here. I would remind everybody on the call that you can submit questions via the Q&A window. And if you prefer to ask your question out loud, you can raise your hand in Zoom and we will unmute you so you can ask your question. If you are joining by phone, you can hit *9 on the phone, and that will also raise your hand in Zoom so that we can unmute you. We have some questions already to start off with. Professor Adair, I'd like to come back to you. You mentioned in your opening, as we discussed the huge scale of this problem, there are some things that you are doing there at Duke to kind of push back against this. Can you kind of run us through some of the stuff that, that your center is doing to combat the flow of misinformation?
You bet. So basically two big efforts. One involves using technology to get people accurate information instantly at the moment they hear a falsehood. And the idea is to use voice to text on when people are watching either a live or taped video, and detect when a politician is making a statement that has been fact-checked before. And if it has been fact-checked before, to pop up on the screen a summary of the related fact check. We call this product Squash, as in squash the falsehoods. And it's very much a experimental product. It's, we've been working on it for about 2 years, and we've made some great progress but there are still several challenges. One is voice to text that we all know is imperfect from talking to Siri. Another is algorithmic matching, trying to match the statement with the correct fact check in our database. And another is, what do we display on the screen so that it's not too intrusive to the viewer? Still, we're very encouraged by this. Squash is doing well. We've introduced a new tool to it that lets a fact checker help decide what to display, and it's called Gardener, in keeping with the gardening theme. And so we're pretty excited about Squash. We'll be testing it more during the debates and during the political conventions, to the extent that the conventions have public speeches now. And then our other product is very much a behind the scenes infrastructure product that tags fact checks that are published by the world's fact checkers. As the founder of PolitiFact, I also started the International Association of Fact Checkers and have worked with them and with Google and Facebook to establish standards so that when fact checkers publish, they put tags on their fact checks. That's kind of boring, but really important. And what it does is allow the platforms to identify fact checks and surface them at relevant times, and also use them to identify false content. Our latest effort involves fake videos and fake images. It's a product that that we're calling Media Review, and we're really excited about it because it has the potential to create a system that YouTube, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram can use to identify fake content and then take action. And it's and I think it's a really exciting system. It's all based on independence. The fact checkers do journalism independently. They embed this code with their fact checks, and then the platforms decide what they want to do. Some may decide they want to remove it. Some may decide they want to put labels on it, whatever. Very excited about that. And we're also doing that here at Duke.
Fantastic. And some follow-up there that I'll have for some of our other panelists and for you. But Professor Napoli, I want to come back to you for a minute. You know, Professor Adair was just mentioning about political speech there, and US law as policy has traditionally treated political speech as kind of a special category of speech that deserves a certain kind of deference. But I mean, in an environment where even wearing a mask is considered political, that means we now kind of have this loophole where blatant and harmful falsities can be categorized as political speech. How much is that loophole contributing to what we're seeing now, and what can and should be done about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and this is it sort of gets to the larger sort of dilemma we're facing now, you know, in relation to the incredibly strong First Amendment tradition that has characterized our country, and suddenly it's ironically part of why we are less informed rather than more informed. You know, falsity is very, very strongly protected by the First Amendment. And it really does create a situation where even if, and that's a big if, even if we could imagine a scenario or an approach where some sort of you know, governmental regulatory framework for addressing this falsity could be put together, it really would probably collapse under a First Amendment challenge, and you know, under the basic fact that falsity, and especially within the realm of political speech, is protected to the fullest.
Gotcha, absolutely. Professor Peralt, I'd like to come to you. Professor Adair was just mentioning about, you know, the ability to fact check on social media. You've outlined the perils or the potential downsides of social media platforms kind of controlling the speech. But how much responsibility do you think that social media bears to remove information that's demonstrably false? You know, if that can be proven.
Well, so they don't have much legal responsibility. I mean, they're protected both by the First Amendment and by Section 230 in terms of legal responsibility for removing content on their platform. I generally tend to think that that's actually a positive thing. You can go to the individual speakers and hold them liable for things that they post that's illegal. You can hold them liable under federal criminal law for things that they post. But as Professor Napoli was just describing, we have a strong First Amendment free speech tradition in this country, and I think we do for very good reason. And diverse speech, including speech that that might be false or abhorrent, is speech that that is supposed to be permitted in our discourse. I think that at a time when there is concern about the power of tech platforms, it would be odd to encourage them to be more aggressive in removing speech that is protected by the First Amendment.
Gotcha, thank you. Professor Hillygus, you said in your opening remarks that persuasion is difficult and a lot harder than people think. But do you think, how much of a danger is there that when people are exposed to misinformation that confirms what they already believe or exaggerates what they already believe, that it is leading to more calcification, of attitudes, or maybe making people even more resistant to anything that doesn't agree with what their viewpoint already holds? So do you think there's a risk that misinformation is contributing to kind of stubbornness on both sides of the political spectrum right now?
I think there's no doubt that misinformation is becoming part of the warfare of political polarization. Oftentimes, though, it is about the one side talking about how dumb the other side is because they believe in some type of misinformation or something that can't possibly they imagine be true. And so again, I think that what I would focus on is there's no doubt that we are polarized today, right? And I guess that when we think about the role of misinformation in that unfortunately we often focus too much on in media coverage and on how we are different, right? And less on similarities. And so some of the work that the Polarization Lab is doing right now is actually forcing people to talk with individuals from the other side. And one of the common responses is just to find like, oh, I didn't realize how much we actually had in common. Without the framing of a piece of information in a political context, that it oftentimes gets evaluated in a very different way. So in part, it is the packaging of the misinformation as part of political discourse, as being on one side or the other. Particularly when we think about misinformation that might be coming from either a foreign source or a source that people on both sides of the aisle can disagree with. That focusing on examples in which there is disagreement rather than agreement has this unfortunate consequence of making people think, dividing information and beliefs into one team or the other.
Sure, absolutely, that makes sense. Thank you. We've had a question come in from Aaron Keck with the Hill in Chapel Hill, and Professor Adair and Professor Napoli, I want to get your perspectives on this, and the other panelists can feel free to weigh in too. So Aaron says that extreme voices and polarizing figures can attract higher ratings and increase page views, so news outlets often have an incentive to amplify those voices. But how might the profession or the industry need to change to address that issue?
Yeah, that's a classic challenge, I think, in all kinds of journalism, because there's always the tendency to pick the extremes. Sunshine was making the point of, as journalists, we focus on the fight over the mask rather than the 97% of people who are complying with masks, which is, I think, a legitimate complaint. But of course, it's not news when dog bites man. People will say it's news when the man bites the dog. So I think we have to be responsible, and I think we have to put things in perspective for people and make sure they understand when we are talking about the outliers. What's changed in the digital age is that the outliers, the fringe, has a megaphone they've never had before. In the analog age, the small percentage of people who had conspiracy beliefs couldn't get together very easily because they didn't know who the other people were. But the digital age has made it much easier for them to get together and made it much easier for media organizations to report on that and suggest that it is a bigger thing than it is. And so I think that's a great point, and we need to be much more, even if we report on the fringe, we need to make sure that it's put in perspective. And often that may be not to report on the fringe.
Sure, that makes sense. Professor Napoli, we've had a question come in for you specifically. You mentioned in your opening remarks about there's been an explosion of news outlets that masquerade as local news outlets, sometimes using defunct websites for these, but they're actually really hyper-partisan and spreading misinformation. Do you know of anything being done to combat this phenomenon? And are there any particular suggestions you can offer for news consumers to kind of help them spot these misleading websites?
Sure. On the first part about whether this is something that can be combated, it's really hard to identify something. In many ways, what we're seeing is a return to what journalism looked like 100 years ago, when in fact, so many of the newspapers that served a community were affiliated with political parties. And so that's what we're seeing a lot more of now. Seeing these outlets sprout up but the difference this time around is that a lot of times the exact nature of the political operative or the PAC or whoever it is that is funding this news outlet is very hard to determine. If you go to the site and you start poking around and you go to the usual places, the about link and things of that sort, a lot of times you are not finding what you need to find about who is actually funding this operation. So it does require, and that's the thing that we've, that's worth emphasizing, I think, that today's news consumer has to do a lot more detective work in order to assure oneself that you're being informed by legitimate news and information sources. There's a lot of talk these days about digital literacy and news literacy. That's sort of what I'm talking about here. This idea of doing substantial, unfortunately, background work to try to determine who is behind the news sources that you might be consulting, that might be showing up in your news feed.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I think there are remedies there that platforms can consider that are ways to give people more information without interfering with speech. So I think some platforms are experimenting with adding context, for instance, as Professor Napoli was alluding to, adding more context about the source of information or who the poster is, which would in theory enable people to make their own decisions about whether to give it much weight. I agree with him that those disclosures are often probably insufficient, but I think that's a productive area to explore because it permits the speech to exist and then provides context that enables consumers to make their own decision about the weight that they want to place on it.
And I would just add that this is I think a perfect example of where we ought to be focusing a lot of attention. And that is what are the institutional failures that are contributing to the misinformation environment. And so again, I think there's all kinds of reasons that we need to be concerned, but to the extent that we can focus attention in the media, scholarship, and so on, not only on the fact that it's out there, but what are the institutions in place that we could change without, as has been alluded to, stepping on First Amendment rights. That is where I think that we have a long way to go, and could possibly find common agreement across the aisle among policymakers.
Well, and that would be a very rare thing in this day and age. But Professor Adair, I'd like to come back to you. There's been this discussion of fake news sites, and of course, we're already starting to see sites masquerading as fact checkers when that's not at all actually what they're doing. And at the same time, seeing reputable fact checkers sometimes in some quarters being dismissed just because the conclusions they draw don't match with a person's political beliefs. How much of a problem is that? How much are you seeing A, resistance to fact checking, and B, a kind of pollution of fact checking by sites that aren't what they purport to be?
So the resistance to fact-checking has really always been there. And I always liken it to being a Duke basketball fan, that I know that the referees in the ACC are biased against Duke. And I just know because I've watched them be biased all the time. And so I think we just have a tendency to think that that the referee is calling against our team. And that's been the case since I started PolitiFact in 2007. And I think the biggest thing we can do in the journalism community is be transparent about our work and show how we reached our conclusions, which is something PolitiFact does, I think, quite well. And but also to make sure that there is absolute nonpartisanship by the fact checkers. And I think that's also something that all of the fact checkers that are part of the International Fact Checking Network and have signed the Code of Principles have agreed to all around the world. And of course, this is a problem all around the world. But you know, it's a problem of refereeing, and it's a problem of passion for your team. So I think we're just going to always have that because of passions for our team. In terms of the masquerading as fact checkers, that's an interesting thing. We were dealing with a case the other day that was not really insidious. That was just an organization that was calling something fact-checking that was not fact-checking. And we were debating whether to put it in a database that we keep in the reporters lab here of fact-checkers. And I said to one of my colleagues, I was just like, you know, this is because fact-checking is cool, that everybody wants to call what they're doing fact-checking. And so, in this case, it was not insidious, but we have seen evidence in other countries where governments will start organizations that they call independent fact checkers that really aren't. You'll have propaganda arms that will do fact checking. You'll have, you know, Russia Today does fact checking. So, you know, it's not so. We do have to be mindful of that. And the way that we deal with it, I think, has been smart. The International Fact Checking Network has this code of principles. We have a process for that fact checkers have to pledge that they're going to be nonpartisan, that they're going to be transparent about their funding. And then there is a review process that they go through. And if they become a signatory, they get to put this emblem on their website. And so that, I think, has really helped a lot. And so to really know who is a legitimate fact checker, you can look to see if they are an IFCN signatory. And that has been a really good step toward that problem.
Absolutely, thank you. Professor Hillygus, we've got another question for you. You study polarization, and we've had another question from Mary Keck, where, you know, right now it seems like certainly America is extremely polarized, but there have been other moments in history that seem that way too. Are we, in fact, more polarized now than in the past, or, you know, are we just as polarized today as we've ever been?
So, you know, this is something that I think there, by every metric you can look at, we are more polarized than we were, say, mid 20th century. On the other hand, I think it's partly a question of where we look. You know, when we look at politicians and the parties, the extent of polarization is massive and clear. When we look at, you know, how Democrats view Republicans and Republicans view Democrats, we also see pretty large, even within the public, polarization in what is called affective polarization. At the same time, when we look at people's beliefs in the issues, there is much less polarization than is often characterized. You know, the public as a whole, you know, still has some, you know, issue preferences that there is considerable common ground. And so it's one of the things that I think is so important for us to remember in talking about polarization is that to some extent the real problem and puzzle is why is it that our political system is not adequately representing the views of the American public where there is common agreement. And so that's, to me, that tends to be one of the biggest questions that we are overlooking and kind of focusing on our differences. And whether we look at, there's a variety of different reasons for that, and ways that there are, I think, institutional failures within the democratic system in the US that are leading to this gaps in representation, essentially.
Sure, thank you. As a follow-up, and I'd also like to get all the other panelists' thoughts on this too. Is it because, because we've got this flood of misinformation, but we have more information in general available, are we more or less informed than we were in the past, by and large, from what you can tell from your work and research?
So in terms of, public opinion, assessments, there has not really been as much as a change as you might expect. I mean, along some metrics where you're testing the civics knowledge of, high school students, you'll see some declines. But by and large, I go back to the point that the American public doesn't necessarily know a lot in terms of facts, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are irrational in their political decision-making. Or unable to kind of become more knowledgeable about an issue when it becomes important. And I actually think that COVID is one of those examples, and we run the risk of backtracking on that as we pull it into and make it more partisan and polarized. But I think that what you would find in looking at the polling data is that this was also an instance of pretty profound public learning about the pandemic, where people didn't have a great body of knowledge, and over time that has increased, and unfortunately what we might see is that becomes polarized as the issue itself becomes polarized. But it's I often like to say it's not as bad as we often think.
I think that's a great point. Yesterday, the Gallup came out with a study the Knight Foundation paid for, and one of the big points was people are overwhelmed with all this information, and this is why I think email newsletters are still so popular, because people want us to make sense of the world for them and to distill things for them. And so in that sense, email newsletters are the new front page, that we're just distilling stuff and telling people what's important and what they need to know about the world, the nation, their local community. And so I think there's more information than ever, but people still want journalists to make sense of it for them. And they still want us to hold power accountable. They just want to be assured that we're not biased in doing it. And that's a big, big complaint in the study yesterday, and something we seriously need to address. And something we haven't had much opportunity to talk about today, but I think that's also critical.
Gotcha, thank you. Professor Perot, I'd like to come back to you. We had congressional hearings with tech CEOs last week, and we heard once again the allegation that online platforms suppress conservative viewpoints. Where is it seems blurred, but where is the line between policing misinformation and suppressing political speech? Like, is there a line that can be found? Professor Napoli, I'd love to hear your take on this too.
Well, so I guess I would say I don't think, and there are others on the of this group who probably have done more empirical research on this, but I don't think there's any evidence of platforms suppressing conservative speech. So conservatives continue to make that point without evidence of it. I think some platforms have done their own sort of self audits to try to figure out if there's something to that claim, and my understanding is that there's not. I think it's very difficult actually to remove misinformation, because the things that we all agree to be false, there's limited agreement about what we all agree to be false. One example of that, I think, is the Tom Cotton op-ed that ran in the New York Times and was very controversial and resulted in the resignation of the op-ed page editor. I personally disagreed with the content of that op-ed, but polling data I've seen suggest about 51% of people believe that the military should would support the military intervention against violent protests. And so it's not clear to me, as objectionable as I find that viewpoint to be, that that social media platforms should police that kind of content, even if some percentage of the population thinks that it's deeply wrong. And so from my perspective, that's why it's better for social media platforms to stand back and allow a variety of different viewpoints to be heard, including views that are some people view to be incorrect. And then to the extent that there are violations of law, or that you want to pursue the speaker for things that they've said, that you can do that directly, but not hold the intermediary responsible.
Gotcha. Thank you. Professor Napoli, anything to add on that? How do we find this line between, suppressing political speech, but policing misinformation?
Sure. And I think,
I think you're muted.
Oh, thank you. Now I'm good, right? I'm good?
Yep, you're good.
All right. Going back to the hearings, it was very interesting to watch the CEOs get grilled about this notion that they are suppressing conservative speech. And it leaves a question hanging in the air, and it's really not a question. And I say this, reluctantly, but but the data bear this out, and the platform's own data would bear this out. And it's, in some ways, it's a shame that they are not able to say this explicitly, which is, we have a set of objective standards that we apply to identify misinformation and try to police our platform accordingly. Unfortunately, the data show that right-leaning outlets and right-leaning speakers seem to be more frequent violators of these policies. There's been a number of studies that have unfortunately shown that, and there's the explanations behind that are I think is open to to argument and interpretation at this point. But we can't just ignore that is a possible reason why any of these patterns that are being put forth are taking place.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Thanks everybody who submitted questions so far. I would remind you that you can submit questions in the Q&A window, or you can raise your hand in Zoom and we can unmute you to ask a question. Another question I have that I would like to get the takes of all four of you on is this distinction between disinformation, whether coming out of Russia or people trying to influence the election, deliberate attempts to mislead people, versus misinformation, when people are just misinformed or they're just mistaken about what they're sharing. How big of a distinction, is it important to make that distinction? And is one of them a much bigger problem than the other, or does it really matter? Phil, please go ahead.
The fact that intent, I mean, I can't imagine, it's so difficult whether it's a platform or a news organization or an individual news consumer, to be put in this position of having to judge intent, which is really so much a part of the distinction between disinformation and misinformation. Not unlike when we talk about libel and things of that sort, which was the intent there. It just seems like a very high bar to make matter in this context.
Sure. Professor Perel, do you think that it's important, or do you think that that it's worth platforms trying to draw a distinction there? For example, if you have posts coming from Russia that are clearly purporting to be, patriotic Americans talking about doing their duty for the country, is that something that social media platforms should be focusing on, or do you think it again comes under this First Amendment? It's a free-for-all.
Well, they do take action against that kind of content, but they use other components of their terms and other indicia to take action against it. So on Facebook, for instance, you're not permitted to use a fake account, and so a lot of the behavior that you're describing would be removed under the fake account policy. There are also, numerous companies have prohibitions on spam. Many people who are behaving as you describe are engaging in spammy behavior, and so they're removed on those grounds. But I agree completely with Professor Napoli that if you're looking just at speech on its face, it's very difficult to take action against someone saying masks are ineffective because they actually believe it, versus someone who's saying masks are ineffective because they're trying intentionally to sow discord and they know that it's false information.
Sure, that makes sense.
I would absolutely agree that that it's very difficult to get into the business of intent. And again, I guess where I would focus attention is what are things that without kind of stepping on First Amendment might be possible solutions and help the consumer to distinguish. And this gets to the importance of transparency and sunlight. And so to the extent that social media could report more on source, if it is funded content versus non-funded content, the source of that funding, that these are all pieces of information that allow the consumer to better have context for the piece of information that they're receiving. And unfortunately often gets lost in the transmission of information across the platforms. And to me, that's one of the areas where it would be important to both focus attention in terms of regulation, but also in terms of where we could ask more of the platforms.
Sure, thank you. Professor Adair, I wanted to come back to, you had mentioned about Gallup releasing a study yesterday that said a majority of Americans say the media is to blame for the US political divide, and also said that US trust in the media is declining. What did you make of those findings? Was there anything about it that surprised you? And where do you think we go from here?
I think my response to that was a big sigh. It's so complicated, and I guess personally, as a member of the media, I don't think the media is to blame. I think maybe the media is a part of the problem. It's so complex, but I do think the media should be part of the solution. I think and as Sunshine can address, the issues of polarization are deep rooted, involving everything from gerrymandering to how people consume information, to geographic patterns of where they choose to live, to education and occupation. I mean, these are deep, deep issues. But I do think the media can play a role in helping to get us on the right course to more of a fact-based discussion. And I do get troubled when I see people talk about how biased the media is, and they're basing that on watching a television network that itself is incredibly biased. And so this that's not the way to heal this problem. And I think I've been part for years through my work with the Knight Foundation in discussions about how we can get back to a more fact-based discussion, and I think my biggest belief is the need for media organizations at all levels, and all types of media organizations, to label their content better, to be clear about this is a news story, and this is a story that tells all sides of an issue. This is a news analysis that takes a point of view but is not an opinion piece, or this is an opinion piece. And by labeling that content, regardless of whether it is words or video or audio, I think we can go a long way to educate people about different kinds of journalism, and help to resolve questions of bias.
Sure, absolutely. Professor Napoli, associated with that, based on your research, where do you find, we know that the traditional news industry is having its struggles. Where are most people getting their news these days? To what extent are people still relying on local news, and how much are people just using social media actually to get their regular news of the day? Do you have any sense of that?
Sure. I mean, to some extent, the answer is very much dependent on, first and foremost, how old you are. Local television news is still, for adults, a very significant source of news. And again, for some of us, that might not be something we rely on. We've seen interesting things happen, in response to the pandemic. Suddenly, the nightly network newscast, the good old ABC, CBS, and NBC, nightly newscasts saw their ratings go up substantially. So conditions can affect. But certainly for younger folks, social media is a prominent source. Now, the thing that always bothered me about, though, when people are asked on these surveys, which is what is your source of news, and they say, local TV newscast is one an option, say, and then they say Facebook. Now, that's sort of two levels of analysis. And the real question is, well, what are you accessing through social media? Social media is not a source. It is a distribution system. And so, to say people rely on social media really just scratches the surface in terms of understanding what it is they're accessing through it.
Sure, that makes sense. And Matt, I'd like to come back to you, on that point. As Professor Napoli said, people say that they're using social media for news, but of course what they're doing is clicking through to sources of news. And I guess it brings us back to this question of if social media platforms know that consumers see it as at least a vessel through which they get their news, to what extent, do they have a responsibility to label things as this is news, this has been vetted as news, and this is just like somebody's just offering an opinion, whether they need to distinguish between different kinds of content?
Yeah, I don't think we want social media in the business of deciding what's news and what's not. They've tried to do that some. I mean, Google has made determinations about what classifies as a news organization. Facebook's done the same. I tend to think that's pretty fraught terrain, and including contextual information about sources is much more helpful and useful than trying to proclaim something as news and something as not.
Sure, that makes sense. Professor Hillygus, I'd like to come back to a comment you made earlier. You mentioned about how, when it regards to polarization, things are not actually as bad as many people think. Certainly, things seem desperate to a lot of people. So I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about what gives you hope that people, that maybe we're not as polarized, or that people aren't as poorly informed or as much influenced by misinformation as we think.
Well, I mean, partly it's just whenever we, look empirically at the impact of exposure engagement with misinformation, we have, very little evidence that it's really shifting people's beliefs. On the other hand, part of the reason that it is so difficult to shift people's beliefs is that beliefs are very much, pretty well grounded these days. And so, on the one hand, right, the evidence about the minimal impact of misinformation is an artifact too of the broader information and political environment. I think that in terms of hope, I guess it's not so much that I think that there are not tremendous flaws in the democratic system. I guess the thing that I would like to focus attention on is less that I think that it is fundamentally about the capacity of the American public, and it is more about various institutional failures, and that it includes within the electoral system, but also within the media system. And so it's not that I don't think there are tremendous problems that need to be solved, but I just want to focus attention on the institutional issues that need to be addressed. And I think that, as Bill pointed out, that things like the conflation of news versus opinion, and that's not just about social media and what you share, it's also about when you go to the New York Times and you look at the most recent read, that it is not necessarily right, like pulling up the most important articles that people need to know about. It's pulling up the articles that the New York Times is going to make, they are also being driven by clicks. And so, it's kind of the fundamental issue of the incentives of the various players in democracy sometimes contribute to I think, the worries that we're all worried about. And I just am less worried about the role that individual voters play in that.
Sure, thank you. We're getting fairly close to time here, but Professor Adair, I'd like to come back to you. One thing that we haven't talked about is that obviously the current president of the United States was elected and has governed, if you can call it that, through the repeated call of fake news, fake news, fake news, against anything that has contradicted his viewpoint of the world. So how has his approach to news reporting, if we can call it that, affected the climate with regard to misinformation and with regards to fact checking? Because of course the call there for fake news has been anything it seems that he disagrees with rather than anything like based in facts. But how has the president changed the game in any sense or affected the game of how we try and stay ahead of misinformation in America today?
So one of my students who now works for PolitiFact, Bill McCarthy, did a really fascinating study of this. I don't know if it was for your class, Phil, maybe it was for Ken's class, on looking at how much Republican politicians have adopted the same fake news terminology to criticize the media. And Bill found a tremendous explosion of those attacks after Trump got elected. And so that has had, I think, a really detrimental effect on the standing of objective news organizations. And so, and I think we've got a lot of rebuilding to do to rebuild the credibility of the media because of those attacks. And I don't think those attacks are warranted at all. And, back in 2017, 2018, when these attacks were going on, I think media companies made a mistake by not pushing back. And I think they felt that they could just take these attacks and that they were partisan. But they weren't partisan. They had to do with the credibility of news organizations. And I think they made a mistake. And it's really had a corrosive effect on their standing, and particularly in the eyes of many people on the right. And it's done tremendous harm that it is going to take a long time to heal.
Absolutely. Would anybody else on the panel like to weigh in on how the president has kind of changed the game in the sense of how we talk about this stuff and how much of an effect it's had?
I think it's worth noting that it's put news organizations in a dilemma that at least to a degree that they were not used to, which was to the extent to which the president himself needs to be policed so regularly as a disseminator of disinformation in his own right, and also as a share of misinformation, as in retweeting things that have turned out to be false, etc. So it's and that's not something that's new, certainly not. But I think it's the magnitude of the challenge that news organizations face in their relationship with the president is different in that way.
I would also add just that this is, I think, one of the examples where we are in a new time when it's very difficult for the media organizations to figure out how to cover this type of environment. On the other hand, that what we have seen are members of Congress and other political elites make the choice to follow the president against the beliefs and attitudes of their constituents. And I wish that there was more attention about the extent to which that they are sacrificing, that they are, really disconnected from, even in very red districts, they are oftentimes very disconnected from the opinions of the people who elected them. And that has become, I think, one of the biggest problems in politics and deserves more attention. And there is some evidence that when members of Congress are told about the actual views of the public in their constituencies, that they start to get closer to that in terms of some of the things that they say. And so, again, I think we need to shine light on where some of the real problems are, and that's one of them.
Matt, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it makes it really hard from a policy perspective, both in terms of the policies that companies implement and how they address misinformation, as well as policy on the Hill and in the executive branch. It's very difficult to come up with kind of smart, informed policy in this area without alienating some political constituency. And ultimately, I think having incredibly partisan policy on this issue doesn't serve anyone well.
Absolutely, thank you. We have reached 11 o'clock, so we will call it there. This has been a very robust discussion and an incredibly important one. As we said at the top, it touches everything from COVID-19 to racial justice to the election, everything else. We can only hope people will do a good job of keeping themselves reliably informed. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks to our panelists, Bill Adair, Sunshine Hillygus, Phil Napoli, and Matt Perrault for sharing your perspectives. We host these briefings weekly on subjects from COVID-19 to racial justice to the election and other issues. If you'd like to be included on the advisories for future briefings, please do email dukenews@duke.edu. And in the meantime, please stay well. Thank you everyone very much and have a great day.